Welcome to Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, where we talk about gospel insights through great stories and help you find entertainment that is both true and beautiful. I'm your host, Carl Cranny. I have a PhD in religion and like to write on the intersection of religious themes in pop culture. And with me today, we have the same crew from Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, episode 6, where we talked about Star Trek Discovery. So we're going to go around the horn. Liz, could you introduce yourself? My co-host Liz, everybody.
Yeah, I am a writer of science fiction and fantasy, a reviewer of books, and many other things.
Excellent. And our repeat offenders to talk about Star Trek are two good friends. Carl, could you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. My name is Carl Ha'o. I currently work as a senior manager for Vampires R Us, the the IRS. I have 2 master's degrees and 2 bachelor's degrees, and maybe one day I'll get a PhD. Maybe one day.
Well, my name's Mike Barnhill. I too have a doctorate, but I took the easy way out and I got a law degree. I tell my wife I went the quick way. I'm a lawyer and I practice in commercial litigation and have loved science fiction in all of its forms for a long, long time.
Excellent. Well, today we'll be talking about the first season of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, a new Star Trek franchise set just before Kirk became the captain of the Enterprise. But first, we're going to do our Best Books segment, where we each recommend one thing we are watching, reading, or listening to. Relevant to our conversation today, as we'll get into it, I'm going to recommend the short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, by Ursula Le Guin. I can't explain it. Well, we're going to talk about it anyway, I guess. The question of at what cost could we have a utopian society is an interesting and haunting one that she tries to address in this short story, which is picked up in one of the episodes of Strange New Worlds that I hope we get a chance to talk a little bit about. And it's a short read. You can find it, I'm sure, on the internet somewhere, and we'll probably put a link in the show notes to one of those versions. And it is a short but haunting read that really digs in and makes you think about lots of different issues. And so The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula Le Guin is my recommendation. Liz, what have you got for us this episode?
So I've got an older book, and I skimmed this one in college when I was writing a paper, and just came back this summer to do a full read through of it. It's Orson Scott Card's Folk of the Fringe. Some content warnings on there, the usual Card stuff. If Card is for you or not. But this one is an interesting one because it's a collection of short stories about Mormons surviving the apocalypse. And there's a great iconic story in there where the Salt Lake Valley has become basically reflooded. And so the Salt Lake Temple is half underwater and abandoned. And it's just like very haunting. So lots of interesting science fiction stuff with our culture and our religion in it. It's a very unique book. People either love it or they hate it or feel ambivalent about it. I guess everywhere. I feel like Card was trying to do something really new and he didn't quite succeed. It could have used a few more drafts, but it's definitely worth your time to read if you're a fan of speculative fiction and a Mormon. So there you go. That's Folk of the Fringe by Orson Scott Card.
Interesting. I can recommend at least the first couple of the short stories in that collection.
Not really short stories. Like there's like 2 novellas and 2 novelettes, and then like 1 story that's an actual short story. They're pretty long short stories.
Okay. Well, I think I read the first 2 as a teenager and really enjoyed them, so I can at least give a thumbs up to the first half of the book. So excellent.
Oh yeah, that first one is really good. It's about Latter-day Saints fleeing from the East Coast, making the trek west to get to Utah because they're sure that the church will be still running and there'll still be a government there when everything's falling apart. And it's very interesting. Lots of parallels to the first Mormon migration. So interesting stuff.
That was the one that I loved the most. It was really interesting. So yeah. Carl, what do you have to recommend for us this time?
I didn't really have a whole lot of. I've not been reading anything interesting lately, mostly because it's due to my health. So I've been looking out for my health and mostly been in and out of the hospital. But I can tell you that for somebody who has, enjoyed the tax code for most of his adult life, I've been reading Plan Basics from United Healthcare, and it is a just scintillating read. I recommend it for anyone whose kidneys have failed. You'll just love it. So give it a read sometime, and yeah, you'll be on the right path, I think.
Thank you for that, and we wish you all the best in your recovery from your various medical problems, and hope there are other scintillating reads along the way, perhaps.
Positive news in that area, just so I don't leave you depressed at the beginning of our podcast. I am officially on the transplant list as of last week, so big, huge hurdle overcome. So
excellent. Well, we'll definitely pray that all works out for you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks. Yeah. Mike, what do you got for us this time?
Well, I just started reading Three Body Problem by Cixin Liu. My wife is Chinese and I can never pronounce stuff. Anyway, I'm about a third of the way through, so there's still a lot for me to go, but I'm really enjoying the pacing. And I mean, he's throwing out little hints here and there, little clues. The game is totally weirding me out. But I am really, really enjoying that book so far.
It's a fascinating one. It's interesting it's how it's similar to the science fiction we're used to from Western authors and how it's very different as well because it's by a Chinese author. So it's steeped in a different method of storytelling and a different culture.
Yeah, but it's really, I mean, I'm very much enjoying it.
Well, thanks everybody for your recommendations. Let's jump into our discussion of Star Trek Strange New Worlds. Just to get things started, I really enjoyed this. It felt like we all talked in our episode on Star Trek Discovery or Star Trek Therapy about how we all enjoyed it growing up. And I remember at least Carl and Liz and me all grew up watching Next Generation on Sunday nights with our family, and how this was such a sort of formative experience in our lives to hang out with the family and watch the show that we all enjoyed so much. And we all lamented that Star Trek Discovery was not a show that you could do that with. It was not a repeatable this sort of new Trek that's been coming out isn't quite the same. I felt like this one is the first of the new Trek where I would really feel comfortable watching it. I mean, my kids are 6 and 4, so maybe not quite yet, but in a few years I felt like we could watch this one and really enjoy it. And so it's episodic, sort of like the old Trek used to be. Each episode has a particular arc and it wraps up, and then they go to some other planet for the next episode and have some other adventure with some other thing. So there's different genres represented, different themes, but a couple of through-line plots that help tie it all together at the same time. So I really enjoyed the whole thing, but I'm curious to get everybody else's thoughts as well. Liz, why don't you go first?
I agree with everything you said. I felt like I cared a lot more about the characters on this one than I did on any of the characters on Discovery. And I don't know why that is, because thinking back on Discovery, I feel like they did a lot of the character development, but for some reason they just didn't feel that differentiated, maybe because the solution was always therapy. Whereas I feel like all the problems are very different in this one. And I care a lot more about each of the characters. Something about the writing has just made them more intriguing, more different from each other. I love them all, and I enjoy seeing their personal lives and their adventures so much more than I did on Discovery.
Yeah, cool. Mike, what are your general thoughts about the season before we jump into some specific episodes? And
I think Star Trek is back. This is the same feel that I think we had with the original series with Next Generation. I think they've learned some lessons, right? Like, I really like how, over the whole thing, we've got Pike's future hanging over it, right? We've got the whole thing with Spock, and now they've started wrapping Christine Chapel up into that, right? We've got number one. I mean, everybody kind of has their thing, right? I love seeing younger Uhura figuring out what she wants to do with her life. So it's like we've got things that are kind of helping thread everything together, right? It's not just Monster of the Week. And the cast I mean, I think the Discovery cast is fairly good. I mean, they're fairly good, but you put Anson Mount on there, I'm sorry, he just outshines the entire Discovery cast. In Strange New Worlds, everybody's complimentary. I mean, Anson Mount, I'm a huge fan of his. But the rest of the cast really, it's everybody complements each other, right? It's the writing, it's the acting, it's the production, it's all. This is what I think Star Trek, at its core, really should be, and so I enjoyed the first season immensely.
Yeah, I think Star Trek is back might end up being our episode title. Because it's good, and I think we all kind of agree with that. Well, I don't know. Let's get Carl's thoughts on the season as a whole.
Oh goodness, okay. So I agree with mostly with what Mike said. I have very much enjoyed this season of Star Trek. I love that it's episodic. I love that there is some connection between the episodes. I love there are multiple episode arcs, like with the relationship between T'Pring and Spock. I don't know. It felt overarching. It felt fluffy. Like we called Star Trek Discovery Star Trek Therapy. If I were to look at an overarching, my mind is a mind that looks for patterns. And if I were to look at for the overarching pattern here in the theme of Star Trek, Strange New World Season 1, I'd call it Star Trek Sacrifice. Bear with me for a second while I walk through this. Every single episode from, episode 1, Strange New Worlds, Pike knows his own fate, and he's struggling with what to do with his life based on, foreknowledge of his eventual sacrifice. Children of the Comet, episode 2, they try to prevent the sacrifice of millions of people on Persephone 3 when a comet's going to crash into the planet, learning that some fates are really unavoidable, just like Pike's fate. Ghost of Illyria. Number 1 sacrifices her secret about being genetically enhanced, which is illegal in the Federation. It's going to cost her everything. Memento Mori, episode 4. In the first few minutes of the episode, Pike gives a moving speech to the entire crew about the ultimate, people making the ultimate sacrifice. And it covers the sacrifice of Lon's brother to save her when they're in the Gorn attack. And finally, a crew member pushes the transporter chief Kyle through a closing bulkhead, essentially sacrificing his own life to save another person. Episode 5, Spock Amok. It's all about the sacrifices that Spock and T'Pring make in their relationship for their respective careers. Like 15 minutes in, Pike has to tell T'Pring, who at this point is, Freaky Friday'd into Spock's body, that his focus on yeah, that his focus on Starfleet and not Vulcan culture, which T'Pring is having difficulty with, is a great personal sacrifice, and that's worthy. Episode 6, like, we're not missing a single episode here, people. Lift us up where suffering cannot reach. Literally, a child like Jesus chooses self-sacrifice to preserve an ideal culture. Episode 7, The Supreme Squall. We're back to Spock and T'Pring's relationship and the sacrifices that they make. And to protect T'Pring, Spock sacrifices their relationship by saying he's in love with Nurse Chapel. Episode 8, The Elysian Kingdom. Dr. Mabenga sacrifices his time with his daughter to save her life. Episode 9, All Who Wander. The chief engineer Hammer sacrifices himself to prevent Gorn eggs from hatching on the Enterprise and killing everybody. And then finally, in the season finale, Quality of Mercy, Pike revisits his fate. That when he meets Mott, who's one of the 2 kids who become the cadets that will die in the same tragedy that leaves him a beeping vegetable. So it's the culmination of the season of sacrifice, because instead of dealing with the idea of accepting one's own fate, as Pike does in episode 1, and evolving to people making sacrifices on behalf of others throughout the other episodes in this season, this season finale deals with the morality and conflict of making the decision to sacrifice on behalf of others, making a choice to either tell Mott about his fate. Does Pike choose to tell this little kid about his fate and give him the choice to avoid a sacrifice, or does he make the choice on behalf of that child? And so, like, seriously, the whole season is one sacrifice after another in exploring every different type that there possibly could be. Like, in every different episode, a different member of the crew shows that they can sacrifice. And so it makes them endearing, but to me, it was a little too much. It was like I get it. When you're writing a sacrifice in, leave it for, it's a major theme. It's something that you do to capstone a season. Do it in episode 1, revisit it in episode 10, but don't do it in every single episode. It just seems lazy. That's just my 2 cents.
I like that theme that you've pulled out. I would say I'll take your sacrifice and I'll raise it to heroism. I think that's what we've all felt in this season that we liked better, is because we have a crew who is heroic again, instead of a crew who is neurotic and inward focused on fixing themselves. And the focus on heroism and sacrifice, over dramatic as it may be, makes it feel more optimistic, right? Which is kind of what was missing from Discovery as well. It was a very pessimistic feeling until season 4 was a little more optimistic about humanity. But this is a very much back to Gene Roddenberry's vision of a time when we've dealt with a lot of the problems and humanity is making good choices and dealing with difficult problems in a positive, optimistic way. So I agree with you. I love that you thought of that through line.
It's also how good relationships work, right? I mean, I'm a big fan of Terry Warner's Leadership and Self-Deception, right? You see other people as people, not things or objects. They're not enemies. They're people that are just like you, and you treat them as such, right? So, like, if I'm sacrificing something for my wife, is it really that big of a deal? No, because I love her, right? I'm looking out for her needs. She's looking out for mine. It's the way good relationships work. And I think that's what people respond to when they see Star Trek Strange New Worlds.
Yeah. And so looking at the major conflicts, would you be able to let a planet of millions of people die if you had a chance to prevent it? Would you?
No.
The shepherds, literally fired on the Enterprise saying, you cannot stop this fate, right? The what do they call it? Maharit or whatever it is, alive. It's making decisions and whatever. And of course it's hard for you to see that, but this is one of those morality, issues that they've thrown at you, and that's just episode 2. So episode 1 is could you live with knowing what your fate is? That's a huge one. Then they hit you with the second episode, another huge one. Could you let millions of people die? And then you hit another one. Could you let your relationship die? Or could you sacrifice yourself to protect, your entire crew? Would you constantly be worrying if you did enough, And then you get down to the end, this culmination of, okay, we've gone through self-sacrifice, we've gone through sacrifice for others. Can you sacrifice somebody else for others? And like, I had to sit there and like think for a minute. Like I think that's what I really enjoyed. I didn't enjoy the fact that it felt like the whole season was sacrifice, and again, that was just too much for me. But still, we hit some like major like themes that caused me to stop and question, which to me is what makes a really good show. Entertainment set aside, it makes you think.
Something that, before we get too far away from your initial really good analysis of all the different episodes on this theme of sacrifice, you just hit on it very briefly in your comments just a second ago, that by highlighting the different kinds of sacrifice and the different points of view and the different way the different characters approached it, this is one of the reasons why I felt this was an improvement over Discovery, because all the characters have different worldviews, and that comes out in how they approach these various situations, and that makes for better back and forth between different people of good faith who have legitimate disagreements, which was something that I felt, and I think we all could have agreed, like Discovery seemed to we just kind of stumble along until we all, oh, there's the answer, and then we all sort of agree on it, and there doesn't seem to be good faith disagreement going on as much. And I love that this theme of sacrifice is drawing out that each individual character has a different approach to everything, and that creates a conflict, not in a really bad sense, but in the Gene Roddenberry sense of, we've got most of our act together, but we're still different people and have to work through those implications.
I agree. I'll take sacrifice every episode over therapy every episode.
Fair enough. Mike, go ahead. You had something to say.
Well, actually, mine was straying more from the point, so I'm glad you brought us back. But I will say this, that what you just said reminded me of something I read, and I forget who said it. I think it might have been Anson Mount talking about his character. But this person basically said Pike's superpower isn't being the smartest guy. He's not in the center chair because he's the smartest or he's the best. His superpower is pulling the ideas from everybody else, right? And one of the problems that I had with Discovery was it seemed it didn't. Part of the reason it didn't feel like Trek to me is because it didn't feel like there is room for everybody, right? In this one, like you said, everyone has different, they're coming from different places, but everyone has a place there. To me, I was reading some stuff on, some of the Discovery cast was responding to criticism about the show being too woke. And they said, well, it's Star Trek, it's IDIC, like basically deal with it. And I think they missed the point of IDIC, right? It's everybody together.
Explain what that is for those of our listeners who might not understand that.
Isn't it infinite diversity and infinite combinations?
Yes, but not everybody who's a super Trekkie is gonna get the acronym.
Fair point. But just basically, I mean, and I think that's the way a lot of people feel. Like we're all different, but we're all needed. We're all part of the whole that makes the whole great, right? I feel like it's even with their answer, when they're citing to that, they're basically saying conservatives deal with it, right? Like it almost makes me feel like, okay, well, they think there's not a place for me. Okay, that's totally fine if that's the way they feel. But this new Star Trek Strange New Worlds, really does more feel like there's room for everybody, right? I mean, everyone in that show is different. They all have their different challenges. Every single one of them is accepted.
Like, especially, let's talk about the episode Children of the Comet, because I feel like that was the one that made me feel like, okay, this Star Trek is leaving a little more room for religion than was left in Discovery, where there's basically no discussion of that kind of thing. And even though
I'm gonna put there was in season 2, and I liked that. I also think we're being maybe a little too mean to Discovery as a whole.
Yeah, maybe we won't do so much comparison. But I love Children of the Comet because it rides that line between sure, there is a scientific explanation for this, but maybe there's also a faith explanation for this. And we're not going to come down and say which one it is. We're going to leave the universe mysterious. And I really enjoyed that. It felt very Latter-day Saint to me, just kind of our beliefs about how science and religion work together and not against each other.
Totally agree.
Mm-hmm.
That was a fun episode I really enjoyed it. To see the coincidences pile up to the end, to where even like Spock, who's super logical, and Captain Pike, who I have to say, with Anson Mount's portrayal of him, I have to go back and watch some Next Generation, but I think Captain Pike might end up being my favorite captain, which is high praise. But to have people like Captain Pike and, Commander Spock, who's Mr. Logic himself, kind of go, that's interesting, and think for a moment that maybe their worldviews could not perfectly account for something, was a fantastic moment, both for their characters and for the show as a whole.
Mine's still Avery Brooks because he punched Q.
You can never go wrong with that. But we should talk about Captain Pike, because I love the picture of leadership they give in this one. Like, everyone who's watched the show comments on Pike's dinner parties and how that is such a great, like, that's his captain mode, is like, I'm going to have everybody over for food and talk to them about their problems and give them great advice. Like, we see him gently pushing people, but not like ordering people to, make a decision or whatever. He kind of just gives them advice and pushes them, and he's a very good leader. I loved that, and seeing a healthy crew relationship where he can both be in charge of the ship and also take advice. It's great.
It feels like he's mentoring the next generation of officers more than previous captains. Maybe because he knows he's going to be a beeping vegetable in 10 years. But
it's a good perspective for all of us to remember, right? You don't know when you're going to be gone. So, like, live as if you were going to be gone tomorrow, and do the right thing now, and don't make yourself the only one who can do this.
But that was also stuff he did before, right? Because it was a well-known tradition on the Enterprise, so he was doing all that stuff even before he found out what his fate was.
Sure.
He's just a good leader. And I think I definitely think you sense that, like the reason why, I think, some of the reasons why we've enjoyed it, whether you think it's Kirk or Picard or Sisko or Janeway, there's always a strong leader there.
We're not going to include Archer. We don't talk about him.
I honestly forgot about Archer, and I was specifically trying to avoid Discovery again.
It's the Star Trek meme. What Enterprise?
We don't talk about Archer. No.
There we go. Oh. I feel like the other religiously interesting episode, like most interesting, is the one Lift Us Where Suffering Cannot Reach, which, Carl, you talked about being an adaptation of that Ursula Le Guin story, and it does sound extremely similar.
Yeah, well, no, it's obviously a ripoff of the two. The difference is, and this is not a minor difference, in the Star Trek episode, the child who chooses to sacrifice himself because of this ancient technology that powers their utopian society. In the Ursula Le Guin short story that I recommended earlier, the child is sacrificed. Like, they deliberately pick a child who is old enough to know and, like, miss his mother and to suffer and wonder why this is happening to him. And that's what powers the infernal machine that allows their utopian society to exist. So it is clearly an adaptation, but with that tweak, which turns the first servant in the Star Trek episode into a Christ figure. And so it kind of hits on some of the same issues, but that change is different enough that it also addresses some very different ones, dare I say, Christian ones, in a way that the original short story does not. So I'd be curious to get everybody's thoughts on that one. That was a haunting episode to me.
It was. And it doesn't get resolved neatly or nicely in any way.
No, which is a strength of it.
Do we know how old the kid is supposed to be in that episode? Do you remember? He's not a teenager, I don't think.
Like 10 to 12, it seemed.
10 to 12. It just reminded me of, like, there's this question of, is it his choice? Is he choosing this? Or has he been brainwashed into this, right? Like, that's the main question on which the morality of this choice lies. And it kind of reminds me of some of my friends who, as their kids have gotten to the age of 8, have been like, is 8 really old enough to actually be accountable for your choices? Like, do they really understand what they're choosing when they choose to get baptized? I've known people who are uncomfortable with this. Once they have an 8-year-old of their own, like, theoretically the idea is okay. And then, like, they're like, this is just a little kid. They don't understand what they're choosing and what they're committing to. So that was an interesting comparison I've been thinking about. Exactly how much agency, how old do you have to have agency? How much knowledge do you have to truly have agency over this choice?
Well, and the relationship between culture and agency. If everybody around you is doing this thing, do you really have a choice to not do that thing? Yeah. Which is kind of the point of the short story. It's the ones who find out about why their utopian society exists, who then leave the city and walk away from Omelis is the name of the city, and we don't know what happens to them in the short story. They walk off into the horizon and they're gone, and we don't know. They made their moral choice to not participate in this. So that's an interesting, like, the relationship between culture and agency also gets brought up. So good questions. I don't know, Mike, Carl, what do you guys think of this episode?
So I'm going to admit, this episode really did me in. I had a real difficulty processing it because when you have a problem like this, my brain goes straight to, really? Some idiot a million years ago builds a machine that creates a perfect society and sustains it, but the machine requires the sacrifice of a child's brain. And, like, you couldn't build a machine that, like, if you could build a machine that sustains an entire society, you could build data. Okay? You could build a positronic brain. Like, really? 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 You need a child to be, like, what does that say about, number one, the society that goes with it? Like, we will give you this perfect society, but it's going to cost you the death of an innocent child. Like, did they do that on purpose? Is that, like, what would I, as a citizen, like, oh, I accept your sacrifice, but I'm thinking to myself, really? Like, that, it just seems too much to me. Like, does it seem,
Don't question the premise of the science fiction. Stop that.
you know for these types of episodes, it makes you think. Like, you have no choice but to think, because you get to the end of it and you're like, you either have to think about it and process it, or you just stay mortified for days. Because a little kid, like, they show the body of his predecessor coming out of the machine, okay, and him willingly going into the machine, and I'm just like, who, like, who does that? Like, who is this kid? What is it? Is it brainwashing? Has he been brainwashed into believing, like, or does he just not understand? And, like an innocent child, they have just enough knowledge and understanding to recognize when he sees their parents are, suffering, or other people are suffering. And they don't know exactly why those other people are suffering, but they're willing to do whatever it takes, to sacrifice whatever it takes to ease that suffering, right? So it's a to me, it's an incomplete sacrifice. If you don't really know what it is you're doing or why you're doing your sacrifice, then it's an incomplete sacrifice. It's a waste to me. Admittedly, I'm showing this passion because I was actually really angry at the end of that episode. I just, there's a million different ways this could have been avoided. And I mean, I get that Star Trek wants us to look at the issue of sacrifice, very closely and what it can look like. And, how it, I mean, look at how Pike dealt with it. He was screwed up at the end of the episode too. Like, really? Like, holy crap. So, yeah, that was a very, very difficult episode for me to process and will continue to be for years, I'm sure.
Interesting that to me that the father of the first servant was completely on board with this whole thing until his son was selected, which is an interesting wrinkle as well.
Let me ask you guys this. Given those feelings that you guys have just expressed, how long has it been since Star Trek made you feel that way?
Yeah.
That's why I think we're back to Star Trek. I mean, some of these ethical dilemmas have been part of it since the beginning, right?
Quite a few of these epical. Yeah, I haven't seen something like this since I want to say the one that comes to mind is the episode in the Next Generation where the 60-year-olds on a planet go to die.
Yes, I was thinking about that.
And I still to this day, that one bugs me. It's it gives me an ethical dilemma where I have to really think about it. So, but you're right. You're absolutely right. Star Trek is back in that regard.
Yeah, that's exactly the episode I was thinking of, where they euthanize everybody at 65 or whatever to prevent suffering from old people. And yeah, I resonated with Loaxana Troy in that episode, who was like, no, this is terrible, this is monstrous, but that's Star Trek at its best is like, well, this is what this society has decided to do, and the prime directive that quit by Pike at some point, oh, that's never gonna stick. Well, yeah, we all know that it does. General Order 1 becomes the prime directive because of some of their shenanigans. These are good questions to have a principle in place that says we do not interfere. When something terrible happens, you still got to stick to your guns, and that makes for interesting character arcs and moments when they encounter these different cultures. So yeah, Star Trek is back. I love it.
Okay, is it just me, or are the Gorn just terrifying?
Oh my gosh.
Terrifying.
The original series, they were like campy. You remember the episode where he fights the Gorn, right? It's like, oh, it's a cute costume, okay? Now, like the Gorn, like first time I saw the Gorn in the episode in Strange New Worlds, I was just like, okay, now I know why they're so afraid of the Gorn.
Right? That episode was one of the first. I shouldn't say one of the first. There have been other Star Trek episodes that fit into the horror genre, but this one clearly did. It felt like a combination of Alien and Predator, that like they even had Predator vision with the little Gorn hatchlings running around seeing in infrared, and they were terrifying.
And those were just the hatchlings.
Yeah.
We haven't even gotten to the good stuff yet.
You always think they're not going to be able to come up with another really creepy bad guy. Like there was the Borg, and who could top the Borg? And then there were, but this has done it for me. It's definitely very creepy.
We needed another bad guy in the Star Trek universe, and the Gorn is fitting that bill quite well, as far as I'm concerned.
I wouldn't mind more Tholian too.
I don't remember who the Tholians are.
They're like a silicon-based, spider race or whatever.
Yeah, they don't know much about them. They were from the original series, right? They set up that kind of, their ships weave that web. They're bad guys that haven't really been a big part of it. But I'm like, hey, if we're bringing back the Gorn in awesome ways. Let's bring back the Tholians.
You know, I thought they were bringing in episode 7, the Serene Squall, when they threw up that web shield that entrapped the Enterprise. I thought it was the Tholians at that point. So turned out not to be. It was just the pirates. But yes, they threw in that little I call it an Easter egg, and I thought it was the Tholians. So.
The throwbacks to the original series are interesting to me since I have not watched the original series. They go over my head, but the fact that like it holds up on its own even without the nostalgia, and I like sometimes have to go look it up, but I don't mind. And I feel like that's been a problem for like Star Trek Picard relies a lot on nostalgia factor to make it work. There's a lot of throwbacks to Next Generation, and even Enterprise was that way. Oh, it's like, oh, let's have the episode where they invent the red alert. Let's have the episode where they invent this, and it feels always like it's a just like let's show how this thing was invented or why this term came to be used, and it gets old. But Strange New Worlds manages to do that and reuse those concepts, which work for the people who remember them, and still work for people who don't remember them.
Yeah, I feel this is fan service done right, and that's not a balance that Star Trek has really struck before. And I'm particularly thinking of Star Trek Into Darkness, which was a terrible remix of Wrath of Khan. So, yeah.
Footnote, Lower Decks.
Lower Decks is another one that does a great job with the throwback.
We don't need to get into it, but if you're talking fan service and doing all those little Easter eggs, I mean, you've got to drop the footnote for Lower Decks.
Well, because that's the whole point of like the entire show, is it's just like constant throwbacks to. It would be interesting to see someone who's never watched Star Trek have them watch Lower Decks.
My husband has been watching Lower Decks with me. He does not like Star Trek. I've gotten him to watch maybe like 10 episodes of Star Trek, but it's just like not his thing. Not enough explosions and action sequences. So of course he loved the J.J. Abrams movies. But he is loving Lower Decks, and sometimes I have to explain to him like, this is the story behind this, and this is why this is funny. But a lot of it works without the references, but not as well as Strange New Worlds does.
I even went and rewatched Balance of Terror earlier today to sort of remind myself, because I couldn't quite remember how Kirk handled that situation that Pike in the alternate reality or the alternate timeline is able to deal with it. And yeah, Kirk smokes that guy. It is a great episode, sort of almost a submarine, like a Das Boot in space, sort of, with the Romulan ship and the Enterprise trying to assess its intentions and be sneaky and follow it around and get information and attack it when necessary. I don't know. It's just they did a different. It's interesting to see a remix of that end differently, but it was fan service in all the right ways, and I liked it a lot. We are at like 43 minutes now, so I wanted to talk really quickly about. I would love to see the Gorn. I think we all would as antagonist. The question to me is, and I'd like to get some thoughts on this. They're always about like showing respect for other cultures and different strange new world. You know, we go explore strange new worlds, which is where the title comes from, and seek out new life and new civilizations. What if the civilization is one that is an apex predator civilization? Like they grew up being apex predators and then invented warp drive. Could Gorn ever, like if we go into Discovery Season 5, could the Gorn ever be members of the Federation?
I'm trying to think about the difference between them and like the Klingons, right? Because the Klingons are also pretty warlike, but they also have a concept of honor, and it's not really a predator type culture.
Or the Dominion?
Well, the Gorn are. It would take a lot of evolution. I don't see it happening. Because the Gorn, I mean, literally, the Gorn hatch and they, the broodlings kill each other, for dominance. And it's an instinct. They're governed completely by instinct. And so it's like, huh.
Well, the hatchling, sure, but we still haven't seen the adults. I mean, obviously they figured out warp drive.
Right. I mean, yeah, it's true.
It'll be interesting to see what. That's why I said like we haven't seen like the good stuff yet. I want to see what they do with the adults, and I wouldn't be surprised if it takes them like probably not next, but like 2 seasons to get there. Because frankly, that's good stuff, and I would milk it if I were them.
Yeah, I'll see if they have to fit it into the timeline though, because we need Kirk to fight him on the planet in that ham-fisted hand-to-hand combat situation that they even made fun of it in a commercial for like PlayStation a couple years later where William Shatner is playing next to a guy in a Gorn costume and they get up and they have this exact same fight between the two of them because William Shatner at 90 can still do the same moves because it's that slow of a combat.
Yeah, but I mean, at the same time, I think everyone's pretty willing to accept. I mean, it's like the Enterprise on Strange New Worlds is nicer than the Enterprise D.
I like that they've given up trying to make it look old. It's like, forget it. We're just gonna. There's better effects now, and
we've got better technology. We've got better stuff. Like, well, let's use it. Everyone will accept it. We all kind of get the fact that in the 60s and the 80s and 90s, like we just had different limitations. We get it. It's cool.
Okay. Before we get too far past it, I want to throw in one last thing. Is it just me, or is Spock a total player?
I don't know what's going on with Spock.
Like, if you followed Spock's career through the original series and through the original series movies, right? You really didn't, you thought of Spock as, it's Spock, right? And he's sort of solo, okay? But now, not only does he have a girlfriend, but we also know that he is flirting with Nurse Chapel, and something happens there, and then he goes and dates Uhura. So like he's going from woman to woman on the Enterprise. Like, what a player, man! I didn't realize he was that. Let's just say friendly or active. I did love the arc that they gave him, the character development they gave Spock through the entire season. If I were to give it an alternative to Star Trek Sacrifice, it would be Star Trek. What's Spock doing today? So, because they included some very interesting things, like you didn't know about Spock. He has a sense of humor. He can sing. Do you remember in the second episode on the Comet, matching pitch with Uhura? He was willing to do that. Like, it was like, oh my gosh, Spock can sing. He makes sacrifices for his relationships. He has questions, and doubts about his relationship that he discusses with Nurse Chapel. Anson Mount's character, so Pike comes up to him at one point, I can't remember, it was like episode 8, and pushes or puts an apron on Spock and says, basically do the dishes. And Spock's like, okay. Just like goes and does it. Like, I was like, I mean, okay, great, So they gave him more, I want to say they explored more of his human personality and did quite a bit of it extremely well across multiple episodes. So every episode was always like, oh, what are they going to do with Spock this time? So Star Trek, what's Spock up to?
Especially with that Spock Amok episode. That was just fantastic. This is one of the best humorous Star Trek episodes ever.
They learned a very valuable lesson. Freaky Friday always does that. So
it always does.
I do think the casting of Spock, both in this and the J.J. Abrams movies, as terrible as they were, for at least I think so, the casting of Spock in both of those has been, I think, spot on, and I've really enjoyed seeing these different people portray this fairly iconic character. I wanted to make one point, and then we need to talk about M'Benga's arc through the season. Something that we did not like about Discovery is that, and we mentioned it briefly, is that we feel like for all of us here who are a little more on the conservative side of the spectrum, we don't feel like there was a place for us in the the crew and the worldview of Discovery, something that I really enjoyed about Captain Pike's speech in the first episode to these people who are on the verge of destroying each other with warp technology that we accidentally allowed them to discover. When he says, "This is what my world was like," there were both flashbacks to some of the riots that came as part of the Black Lives Matter protests. And I know not all Black Lives Matter protests had riots, because, Mitt Romney, he marched in one of them, and he doesn't riot. And they also showed clips from January 6th. And so I liked that Star Trek took a moment to point to our society right now with its divisions and say, why don't y'all knock it off and take it down a notch? And I appreciated that it called out the extremists because we got a lot of that running around, and I think Star Trek is at its best when it makes us look at ourselves, and that was just a really subtle moment that helped me think that, yeah, Trek is back, because they're calling out all the shenanigans we're getting ourselves into now in this timeline, and I liked that. I don't know. What were anybody's thoughts about that? And even Pike's speech in episode 1, I just really like that whole thing. You can be better than this, and we used to be like you. Help us help you to not follow in our errors and missteps that we have made.
I like the idea of linking back to current era, problems and issues, because it makes me think that we have a connection to possibly having this type of future, a Star Trek type of future, which may seem totally fluffy on my part, but honestly, that's what I love about Star Trek, is the potential for that type of future. And our own advancement as a species and civilization. So to reach back and make that connection is totally appropriate and something that I personally appreciate.
It struck me really well. I enjoyed it a lot more than I enjoyed. I've been watching the most recent season of Picard, and they time travel to 2024, and it just doesn't work at all in that one. The attempt to call back to problems now, but it's not even our 2024, because it's Star Trek 2024. So there's some technology we don't have, and yet there's still the same problems that we have in our 2024. It didn't quite work, but I felt like Pike's speech really did land. And it's part of the great tradition of Star Trek. The original Star Trek did a lot with the Cold War, right? Analogs with the Klingons and the Federation and the Romulans all in a standoff, and not in war, but sort of in war. And it's definitely something Star Trek does, is comment on political situations currently through the veil of science fiction. And I felt like they did a good job doing that tastefully here, not being like, one side is the problem, that everyone's attitudes are the problem, and we need to talk instead of fight.
So let's talk briefly about Dr. Mbenga's plot line through the whole thing, because I found myself deeply dissatisfied with the way it ended, although I enjoyed the idea of it through the 4 or 5 episodes where they kind of brought this up. What did you all think of the little girl stuck in the transporter whose disease is rapidly progressing, and the sacrifice her father makes to sort of do his best to help her, live a normal life, until he totally doesn't at the end, but anyway.
So I get to the end of this episode, and the theme song to Malcolm in the Middle is ringing clear in my ears. At the end of that, it goes through, "You're not the boss of me, no," and then at the end it says, "Life is not fair." And all I can think to myself is, okay, I can accept that this episode feels like they were just dealing with a problem that was unsolvable and we wrote out of it. They could have kept her in stasis for another 3 seasons and then eventually solved the problem, right? Or done the same episode 3 seasons later, and we would have been prepared for it. it seemed to me like I didn't have enough time to be prepared for the way that we're going to resolve this. And it was, bottom line was, life is unfair. Like, okay, just we have to accept that and move on. So that's what the episode with Mbenga's daughter did for me. Was that was the theme for me, was life isn't fair, and sometimes you just resolve things in ways that are imperfect, and you live with it, right? And Mbenga is going to live with it. Okay.
I know you really liked the rest of the episode, Liz, because it's the holodeck episode this season. They're all acting out the fantasy novel.
Yes, that was super cool. And then yeah, I felt like the writers didn't really know what to do. They were told we got to get the girl out of the pattern buffer and let's just figure out a way. It felt kind of like when they wrote Kess out of Voyager, and it's just like, okay, we need to get rid of Kess because she doesn't want to be on the show anymore, so she's gonna go live with the space aliens now. Okay.
On the upside, they made Anson Mount's character a sniveling betrayer, a weasel in that episode.
Yeah, it was definitely rushed, but I gotta say, the guy who plays Dr. Mbenga is really good. I mean, you could feel the love that he had for his daughter. You could feel how it was tearing him up, not being able. I mean, he should be able to heal her, right? If anybody, his daughter, and he can't. I mean, he did such a great job. It's just unfortunate that they rushed the ending of that arc.
Maybe it's just Star Trek doesn't know what to do with kids, right? Like the whole Wesley Crusher plot line is awkward, and like we have to write him out as fast as possible.
Well, I mean, they gave her an okay ending. As endings go, she got a chance to grow up. She got a chance to experience life in a way that, that we as mere mortals don't get to experience. But at the same time, it just, I don't know, it just felt like I'm trying to put myself in Benga's shoes, right? I'm a father. I've got a child that I feel like it's my absolute number one priority to take care of and to protect and to heal, and I'm not making any strides whatsoever. Um, there's this opportunity to essentially give her up so that she can grow up, but I will miss out on all that time growing up, which essentially means I'm giving up my child for their benefit, which is, I hate to go back to the word, an enormous sacrifice. So like I have to stop and ask myself, would I be able to do that? Like it, I don't have a daughter, and just imagining it is really difficult.
So that's really interesting because I felt like I had the exact opposite reaction to the ending, where the Dr. Mbenga gives his daughter up to this alien entity that he doesn't really know anything about, except that it's making them perform in this really weird sort of fantasy novel that it's plucked from his mind. And it's not just that Star Trek, I think, doesn't know what to do with children. It's that our entire society doesn't really deal with parenting very well. Liz and I are in a chat group together where we discussed this episode a little bit, and I just want to read a couple of the other people, some of their thoughts that I ended up agreeing with here. And I'm not going to name names, but one of them says, I think the writers here are repudiating what it means to have responsibility for a child. Another one says, let go is the message rather than to lean into your responsibility, and that the ending of the episode is wish fulfillment for parents, that you can just sort of hand wave away the raising of a child. Maybe they didn't know what to do with it, but I felt like there had to have been a better way to resolve the situation that would have made the story more poignant and more leaning into a good parenting choice, because giving your kid up to some random entity in a nebula is, I'm quite confident in saying, this is not a good parenting choice.
While you were talking, I realized that they have done the death of a child well in Star Trek, and it was in Star Trek Voyager when the Doctor gets the pretend family, right? And at first he makes his family perfect. And then B'Elanna's like, no, this is not how families work. So she puts in some messed up characteristics for the family. And his daughter, his holographic daughter, plays this really dangerous sport. And she gets injured and she dies. And we see the Doctor have to deal with the death of his daughter and like deal with grief. And that's kind of what is missing here, is that there is no grief for this child who is gone. It's more like sending her off to college than it is like, this child is no longer human. I will not be interacting with this child anymore. They're gone. Maybe they're planning on bringing her back at some point and that's going to resolve, but it lacks the resolution and you end up feeling like M'Benga doesn't care about his daughter at all. And I don't think that's what the writers intended, but that's how it feels.
Yeah, they didn't handle it very well. They've done another episode with the death of a child. Data creates a daughter named Lal, and she dies, and you deal with all of that in one episode. And even though in the back of your mind Data can't deal with it, you're dealing with it for him. You're there, right? And you know that he cares. He may be a machine. But I totally agree with you. It makes it look like M'Benga doesn't really care. I don't know, it's the timing. I feel like I would have been more invested and more forgiving as an audience member had they just held it off, another season or 2 seasons. She could have lived in that transport buffer for a long time. I mean, if you remember the next generation, Scotty lived in a transport buffer for 75 years. So the technology works. So
But that was like the one episode that didn't quite work. Out of 10 episodes, 9 of them were really good, I felt like. That was the one where like it was super fun and then the ending didn't work.
Yeah, just the idea that is a responsible way to resolve the situation is I think clearly incorrect. Anyway. So on our rating of content, celestial, terrestrial, telestial, outer darkness, where would you all place this season of Star Trek Strange New Worlds? How about you first, Mike?
I would say probably terrestrial. They dealt with some really good themes. They dealt with them well for the most part. I think probably the Gorn episode is primarily what's keeping me from saying celestial, but that doesn't mean that was an awfully good episode. But yeah, I'd probably say terrestrial.
How about you, Liz? Where would you put it?
I think I'd put terrestrial too. We do have a couple of, Star Trek level fade to black sexual liaisons. And then I felt like the plot with Nurse Chapel is a little above kids' heads for sure. I wouldn't want to talk about her like dating conversation is like not an example I'd want to set for my kids in particular. I still felt like it dealt with it better than Discovery did. But yeah, I'd put it terrestrial. Just a little bit of caution.
Yeah. How about you, Carl?
I completely agree. I rank it as terrestrial, and for the same reasons as Liz. I felt like there were certain things that weren't necessary. They didn't really add to let's just say my enjoyment of the series, and frankly, I didn't think that they added too much to the overall plot line. They were there just to kind of give, I want to say, a little bit more humanity, and sometimes I think that that for people includes a sexual component, and bottom line for me is it's not always necessary. You could tell the relationships between people without the necessity for those tidbits. So for me, it was terrestrial. I completely agree with Mike. The Gorn scared the crap out of me. But if you just You just kind of accept that maybe, like their children are evil, and some people's children, go through the terrible twos and they're evil. So I don't know, maybe that's just part of growing up,
You gotta eat your siblings. I mean,
I mean, for some people that would be the ideal situation. Anyway, so for my overall is terrestrial. We're landing at terrestrial.
I think I have to agree, terrestrial as well. Overall, maybe some elements or some parts would kick it down to celestial, but overall, we haven't talked about the fact that Spock and T'Pring are engaged, but clearly have had sex with each other. And I don't know that there should ever be a reason for me to see Spock with his shirt off. Like it's just.
but it's in the great Star Trek tradition. It's about the same level as you've seen in other series, right? Those episodes where you'd be watching with the family and your mom's like, "Oh, okay, we're having a talk after this episode, kids."
Sure, but I feel like Vulcans would be very against having premarital sex.
That's true. It doesn't really explore that at all.
Now they've got the Ponfar. They've got every 7 years, man.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, and then aren't they supposed to not? Aren't they supposed to basically not care or not engage in that when they're not in Ponfar in heat? Anyway, there was a moment in their relationship where they just sort of accepted the standard understanding of sexuality in modern U.S. culture, which is that it's fine as long as you love each other or at least have some kind of attachment or consent. It's at least the lower bar, and I feel like the Vulcans would have a different sexual ethic, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
But it's not explored at all here, so.
Not explored at all. Nope, they just assume that that Spock and T'Pring would feel like an average American engaged couple, and I don't think that should be true. Anyway, as far as artistic merit, we rate on 1 to 5 popcorn balls. I think I'm gonna have to give it a 5, maybe a 4.5, because of the Dr. M'Benga stuff, but the writing is good, the special effects are good, the acting is stellar, the different characters all shine. That's a combination of the writers and the actors together. Like, I felt like this whole thing just came together quite well, despite a few individual missteps. But I'm open to the possibility that you guys disagree. So, I don't know. What do you think? We'll start with you this time, Carl.
I give it a 5 too. Despite my misgivings about the overall overuse of the theme of sacrifice and some of my other issues, including the Omega episode, artistically, I think they really brought it. They were, well, how do I put this, Mike? Star Trek's back, baby. So yeah, I'm gonna give it 5.
All right, Liz, what do you think?
I'm same here. I feel like if only one episode has serious writing flaws, we're doing pretty good. So I'm gonna give it 5.
And Mike?
I'm going to say 5. High production values, excellent writing, excellent acting. I've got to say, I mean, we've all seen the first seasons of Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, I mean, Enterprise. I mean, it's understandable, right? While people are trying to get a feel for their characters, that things are going to be a little bit flat, right? I did not have that feeling with this cast. This cast seemed to just nail it right on the head from the get-go. And, great. There's nowhere to go but up for these guys, and it's going to be great.
I would agree with that. As a freshman year for a Star Trek show, this is by far the best, and that is high praise. Yeah. And then on Gospel Connections, morally edifying messages, 1 to 5 apricots. Kind of have an ongoing discussion with some of the other people we've had on about what this means exactly, but to me, it's things to talk about, parallels you could draw. It doesn't have to be explicitly Christian or explicitly religious. And so for me, we've had good conversation here, and I think that is to its credit. I guess maybe I'd feel it didn't quite reach the heights of some of the best of Trek, so I'm going to give it 4, because I think they have room to improve on that just a little bit, but I still want to give it some pretty high praise. So I don't know. What did you all think of on a scale of 1 to 5 apricots on gospel connections? Liz, we'll start with you this time.
Yeah, I feel like it's definitely brought back the moral, ethical puzzle box element that I love about Star Trek. So yeah, I think I'd go with a 4 too. There's definitely more that can be done. We're not to the 4 Lights episode and Next Generation kind of thing, right? We're not there, but it's the first season and they've done pretty well, I feel like. So I give it 4 apricots.
Mike, what do you think?
I'm on board with 4. For the reasons you guys have stated, but also just because they leave things open, right? It's like we talked about before. Like sometimes there's just they're not giving us a clear answer either way, which leaves it up to us to do that, which is great. We're not being force fed something. It's what Star Trek I think has traditionally done well. We're presenting different viewpoints. Think about it.
And Carl?
I think for the similar reasons, I'd give it 5. My favorite thing about church is that when I go there, I have to wrestle with things. I like the idea of facing situations and scenarios that I wouldn't otherwise face and look at them head on and determine what would I do. To face moral quandary is something that we do every time we go to church, every time we discuss something in church, and every time we discuss a church related matter. And I think what I really enjoyed about this season was the direct moral quandaries. They fell along a very similar arc of, sacrifice, which is always a massive, quandary. It always comes down to what's worth it. But that really is the moral quandary that we face every time we face a moral quandary. Is it worth it? What's worth it? What's the right decision? And I think they did that, in a lot of these episodes, and I was impressed with that. I liked coming out of those episodes having to think. Admittedly, some of those episodes I came out just angry, but still, it got me thinking. I had to think about it, and I can appreciate that. So for me, it's a total 5. They to me did an excellent job in terms of theological parallels.
Well, thank you, everybody. For those of you who'd like to follow us and our guests, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Carl Cranny. And Liz, where can people find you?
You can find my writing and book reviews on lizbusby.com.
And Carl, where can people find you?
I'm on Twitter at @ThatCarlPerson. That's my handle.
I love it. And Mike, I remember your comment last time. I don't know if you remember it. Where can people find you on social media?
Yeah, it's still the same. Please have your opinions, but I'm not going to hear them.
And probably mentally healthier for it. Anyway, thank you for joining us this week for this episode of Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree. Next time, we'll be discussing Top Gun Maverick, the 2022 sequel to the original 1986 film about military pilots. It's so much better than it has any right to be, and has an interesting message about forgiveness, so be ready for that conversation next time. This has been Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, encouraging you to seek after everything virtuous, lovely, of good report, or praiseworthy. See you next time.